Hi guys, so in this video I'll be showing you how you can clone your existing clothes. So if you want to find out how you can do this, today we're using a t-shirt. Make sure you keep on watching. So the first thing I'll say is, for the item that you're selecting to help you clone your own clothes, check the stretch of the fabric or the piece that you're sewing to make sure that it has the same kind of stretch that you'd want for the fabric that you're going to be working with. Second thing, as you can see here, it looks a bit more crisp, so I've ironed that, and that's going to make it easier to work with, easier to lay flat. And then what I'm going to do is fold it in half. Also know that I've turned my fabric inside out. I've turned my top inside out so that raw edges are showing, or rather not the raw edges, so the seam allowance is showing. Oh my gosh, I really can't speak. But that way you can use the seam allowance of the top when you are marking out your pattern piece. So I folded it in half, and as you can see, I was matching up the seams to make sure that they are all lined up so it's as symmetrical as possible. The more symmetrical it is the more accurate your pattern piece is going to be when you actually mark it out. I'm working on my cutting mat because it's going to make things a bit easier, and then I've grabbed a kind of large sheet of pattern paper that I'm going to use as well. If you don't have pattern paper, I would recommend get you some, but if not, you can use paper and kind of tape that together as well. And so what I'm doing, I've made sure to get a big enough pattern paper that I can fold in half, because just like I've folded my fabric in half, or my top in half rather, I'm going to make sure that I fold my pattern paper in half as well, and I will explain the reasoning for that in a sec. What you can do is add pattern weights if you want it to be a bit more stable on your fabric, but what I'm going to do is I'm grabbing a pencil and I'm going around all of the edges, and I'm just marking out with my pencil to directly where the seam ends and marking it onto the pattern paper. Hopefully, I feel like I explained that so badly, but hopefully the way that I'm doing it here can add a bit of clarity. And then for the sleeves, I'm lifting up the sleeve a tiny bit because I want to mark out the bodice section first outside the sleeve. So as you can see, I've just lifted up the sleeve a tiny bit, and I'm marking down on the pattern paper where the armpit kind of forms there. And then I'm making sure that as I'm marking that I'm using the seam allowance for the top, so that stitched edge for the seam that you can see there, I'm using that to mark it out as well, and that's going to be the seam allowance for the pattern paper that I'm marking. So what I would do as well is measure that seam allowance that you have, just to make sure that it's the right size, and you'll see me do that later on, so don't have to worry about that now. So because we're marking this out, and there's a back piece, so there's the back of your top and there's the front of the top that has a different neckline, what I'm going to do as well, so I've marked out initially the back section of the neckline, but I'm going to go ahead now and lift up just that little flappy bit to mark out the front of the neckline as well, and that way when you pull it away from the fabric, you'll be able to see what should be the front neckline and the back neckline. And then what we're going to do, we're going to grab a sharper, darker kind of marker, and I'm going to make those lines a bit clearer so you guys can see it, and so granted it's easier for me to see as well for a pattern. I'm also using my French curve. You can use a ruler if you prefer, and I'm making sure that those lines are as accurate or as neat as possible, because initially I just went in freehand, but this time we want to make sure that those markings are as accurate and as neat as possible, as much as possible. So for the armpit measurement, as you can see, I couldn't get all of the dots to kind of line up with my ruler, so what I ended up doing is connecting the dots bit by bit. So as you can see, I'm making sure that my ruler is touching both points, or at least 2 points at once, and then I'm connecting those dots as I go along. Hopefully the way that I've explained that makes sense. So we're moving quickly, but definitely feel free to pause this video and rewind if you need to. What I'm doing now, so I've marked on myself from my shoulder to my waist, which is where I want the top to end for me, because we were working with a bodysuit initially, but I want this to be a top. And then I've marked out on the fabric, on the pattern paper rather, the length, so that for me is 18 inches, and I've added half an inch for seam allowance, and so that's what I've marked out there, and I've cut that out. So I've gone ahead and cut out those markings. Mind you, I've cut out the back neckline instead of the front neckline, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to fold my fabric, the pattern paper rather, in half again, and I'm going to cut one side, and I'm cutting the front neckline on that side. So once I've cut out that front neckline, then I'm going to reopen back up the pattern paper, and this time that little marking or that line there, we're just going to cut really carefully straight down, and that's going to leave us with a back piece and a front piece. And for these pieces, it looks like almost like your body has been sawn in half, but that's kind of what we want, because we're going to be using these pattern pieces as pattern pieces that we cut and fold, and that basically means that when we fold our fabric, or when we use our fabric, we're going to fold the fabric in half, just like we did with our top, and we're going to cut it out that way, and then when we open it up, it's going to reveal like the full front piece for the front piece pattern, and then the full back piece for the back piece pattern. So I'm going ahead and labeling up my pattern as well, which is really a key step, because if you're making loads of patterns from your clothes, ideally you need to know which is which. So the key things that I add to my patterns when I'm labeling them is the cut and fold line, if that is needed, just the name of the pattern piece, or whether it's the back piece or the front piece, whether it's stretchy or non-stretchy, and whether or not I've included seam allowance. So for this one, we've used the seam allowance from the top that we had, which is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm just marking that onto the pattern paper for both the back piece and the front piece as well. So now moving on to the sleeve, and I'm grabbing my pattern paper again and folding that in half, and I'm grabbing my sleeve, as you can see here, and I'm lining that up with the part of the pattern paper that I've folded in half, and I'm just going around and marking the sleeve out, and again I'm lifting it up to get underneath the sleeve, if that makes sense. So I'm marking out the armhole for the sleeve, and for this one I don't have it, so I've made this sleeve symmetrical, and if I need to make adjustments to make the back of the sleeve fit better, then I'll do that later on. But if you prefer, you can mark out the front of the sleeve separately from the back of the sleeve, and do it that way instead. So yeah, I've marked out the sleeve, and then I'm just going in with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am marking out, or I'm adding that seam allowance to the sleeve as well, so it has the same amount of seam allowance that we've added to the top for the sleeve section. And once I've done that, I'm just going to go ahead and cut it out, and then I have my sleeve. So yeah, I'm cutting that out, and just to mention as well, so I've added 1/4 inch seam allowance for everything but the hem of the sleeve, so that bottom bit. And for that, I've made it 1/2 inch seam allowance, because that's going to be the hem for the sleeve that we're making. But yeah, once I've marked that out, I'm just going to cut it out, and then I'll hold my sleeve pattern, and then we just need to label it. So now I'm just going ahead and labeling my pattern by putting the name of the pattern. So it's a sleeve pattern, so I'm just making that clear. The size as well. What I should have added is the fact that I need to cut 2 pieces, because there's going to be 2 sleeves, and I'm also adding on the fact that I've included 1/4 inch seam allowance as well, so that's all clear. And once you've done that, you're basically done. If you did enjoy this video, let me know, and be sure to check out these other beginner friendly sewing tutorials as well. I'll see you there. Bye guys.